I'm Dr. John Oldham. I'm Chief of Staff at the Menninger Clinic, and it's a wonderful opportunity today to have a wonderful guest, Lord David Owen, who's visiting us from the UK. David, we're delighted to have you here today, and I'm going to tell people a little bit about you, which is hard to do because there's so much I could say. But to start, just a few facts about Lord Owen. Lord Owen is a member of Parliament in the House of Lords, has been there for 26 years, and has done so many things, which include serving as Minister of Health, the Navy Minister, but also Foreign Secretary. I think 2 times, am I right?
Only once.
Only once. I thought it was twice. Might have been. He's co-founder of the Social Democratic Party and was its leader from '83 to '87. He became a life baron in '92 and currently sits as an independent crossbencher, and as an American I had to learn what that meant, but I did, in the House of Lords. And he served as the European peace negotiator in the former Yugoslavia in '92 to '95, working with UN-appointed Cyrus Vance, peace negotiator, and they developed what's become known as the Vance-Owen Peace Plan. In the U.S., we might refer to you as Dr. Owen, because not everybody would realize that Lord Owen is a physician, trained as a neurologist and very interested in neurology and neuropsychiatry. He's a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians. It was my great fortune to meet Lord Owen in areas of mutual interest, which have to do with my interest in personality disorders and his interest in a syndrome he's going to tell you about that we'll get to in just a second. He's a prolific writer, and I can only mention a couple of things. One of the books that Lord Owen wrote is, I highly recommend, one called In Sickness and in Power, which is a study of world leaders in the last century and the kinds of either medical or psychiatric, sometimes, illnesses that various leaders have had and how those have influenced decision-making and periods of leadership in office. A second publication is called The Hubris Syndrome, and that's a really interesting book that was published originally in 2007, I believe, and then a new edition just came out last year, which looks at a particular interesting syndrome that we're going to talk about. So you've heard enough from me. I want to turn things over to you, David, to hear about things that you've been working on, and in particular, I think we might start if you tell a little bit about this concept of the hubris syndrome and how you came to develop that.
Well, hubris is a Greek word, and out of Greek mythology, there was this concept which the gods didn't like, really. It was the person who was supremely arrogant, who didn't listen to anyone else, who knew what he wanted or she wanted to do. And it's a good word, really, I think, to describe what I've called an acquired syndrome. It's something which you're not born with. It's something which is not accompanied by any other psychiatric illness, depression or anything like that. And it's usually amongst achievers who, when in power, when exercising power, whether they're a business leader, a professor, a politician, you name it, they get intoxicated by power, which was an expression Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, used. And it seems to grip them, and they change, and they get an acquired personality change, which we always thought before couldn't happen. Then we had post-traumatic stress disorder after wars and other things, long argued by the medical profession. And I think hubris syndrome is in that category of acquired personality changes.
Oh, that's really interesting. And we talk about personality pathology and personality disorders as illnesses. That's a concept that's certainly widely endorsed. So how would you say someone would be identifiable who would be potentially vulnerable to develop this syndrome, or do we know how to predict?
I think we're beginning to learn. I mean, hubris syndrome is not yet accepted by the medical profession. I think it's going some way towards it, but I think one of the things that you're looking for in business, for example, the board, the independent board, are always eyeing the chief executive. If they get above themselves, they start to make all the decisions. They take huge risks without thinking through the consequences. We need risk takers in life, and we certainly need them in business and in politics. It's when they overreach themselves, and that's when they often bankrupt their company, actually. If you look at the global economic crisis, many of the big leaders in the companies that collapsed on Wall Street or in the City of London had personality changes about them, and they thought they could core the market. They took huge risks and came out very badly unstuck.
So can you give us an example of someone as one of the world leaders where this syndrome seems to be persuasively
Well, I got interested in it when George Bush Jr. and Prime Minister Blair decided to invade Iraq. There was a case. Saddam Hussein was obviously an extremely evil leader and a bad leader, but they went into Baghdad, and we suddenly discovered that they had no plan for what they were going to do afterwards, in the aftermath. And it was almost as irresponsible. It was as if they had one single thing, that what they was doing was right. It was the correct thing to do, almost the good thing to do. And both of them have very strong religious beliefs, and they ended up in a complete and absolute mess. And both countries have lost a great deal of weight in the world through what was a misadventure undertaken on the basis of a very strange reading of the facts and conducted with ineptitude and irresponsibility and ineffectiveness that's quite breathtaking, really.
So what happens? These are people who have obviously enormous ability, enormous leadership skill, who have been very successful. So what changes? Do they sort of lose connection with their teams? Do they sort of go out on an island?
They were not wise. I don't think they listened. Very often these people get into a sense of groupthink. They're surrounded by people who are reinforcing their prejudices. They have a view of the world. They took the view that it would be easy to topple Saddam Hussein and forgot that this was a very complex society and split between Sunni and Shia with a strong element of Kurds. For years, very difficult to hold together as a country, and they seemed to give no weight to the complexities that would follow toppling of Saddam Hussein. And they didn't put anywhere near enough troops in, and they didn't handle what was going to be a very complex thing by, in the case of Blair, certainly not listening to very expert advice in the Foreign Office and other areas. Why? Because they knew one big thing. They were sure. They didn't need to be told.
Interesting. Well, then what happens later? I mean, do things settle down after the sort of stress and intense moment passes?
Well, if it is an acquired personality change, when power goes, they should change and maybe even change back. And that is what looks as if it has probably happened to George Bush Jr. He seems content to retire to Midland, Texas. He doesn't seem to be feeling he has to be on television. He's been very generous to his successor, President Obama. And overall, I think his memoirs was rather appealing, rather attractive, whereas Tony Blair's memoirs are quite different. He's busy running around the world, and there's very little contrition over what happened in Iraq, very little insight, and certainly he's not lost his hubris.
So one of them, if we use the term syndrome, might be in recovery from the syndrome, the other not.
Yes. These are only two examples, but we've seen it before. Yeah. We've lost a number of prime ministers in British. Margaret Thatcher, at the peak of her power, was turfed out by her fellow Conservative members of Parliament. Neville Chamberlain believed he and he alone could talk to Hitler and ignored his cabinet and went and did the appeasement policy largely by himself.
Well, you know, we had a chance to visit our professionals in crisis unit here, and many of the patients there are very successful, either businessmen or physicians or leaders. Some of them have something we call narcissistic personality disorder. But even there, I think that's not necessarily fatal to have in terms of life success. I think it can, in fact, be superimposed with a syndrome like this under periods of high stress. And we think we're able to help them when they're here get back to a better level of functioning and maybe out of that kind of loss of contact with the rest of the world.
I think you can help chief executives who get this syndrome with mentoring. I think that you can spot it very early on in young executives. You need risk takers. I'm not trying to be censorious about risk, but you also need to be able to control it. And it's the job, really, of boards of companies to watch very carefully their chief executives to try and ensure that they're keeping their feet on the ground. They're not being carried away by their circumstances and by their position. I do see it as a change brought about by power, and power does have an intoxicating effect on men and women.
Yeah. Well, you know, I wish we had all afternoon to talk, but we don't, because we really have to keep this fairly brief. So let's close with one thing. You've set up something called the Daedalus Trust in the UK, and you're sort of interested in something like that in this country. Just say a little bit about that and how you see what your future hopes would be.
Well, Daedalus was the father of Icarus in Greek mythology, and he warned his son that though he had designed the wings not to fly too close to the sun because the wax would melt, the sun ignored it and fell down and was killed. And that is the spirit of it. It's to try to research this issue, which can do great harm, great damage, but we need to understand what lies behind it. And it's not going to be just medicine and doctors. It's going to be philosophers, anthropologists, psychologists. And we tried to bring them all together to look at this program over a longer period of time as a multidisciplinary approach to try and find out what was it that turns them, what changes them, how do we spot it, how do we prevent it, how do we mentor it?
Well, at the Menninger Clinic, we deal with these kinds of issues in the realm of psychiatry all the time. So this is very interesting to me and to all of us. We would be very interested to keep tuned in to what you're doing, and I will certainly be doing that. And it's just wonderful to hear about what you've been thinking about and also what your current agenda is, which we think is just enormously important. And if there are ways that we at Menninger can be of help and participate as you go forward, we would love to. Thank you so much for coming to visit with us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I've enjoyed seeing the clinic very much.
Great.